Hey guys, welcome back. So today I'm at the indoor range with my 9mm kit and my black Tavor. I've converted it from 5.56 into 9mm, and I've left this rifle as a 9mm for the most part, and I keep my flat dark earth rifle as a 5.56 gun. But the reason I'm out here today is I want to show you a new product from shootingsight.com. It's a trigger assembly that allows you to quickly drop in a replacement trigger, the shootingsight.com trigger, take out your OEM, put it aside, and it reduces your trigger pull down to about 5.5 pounds. It's also a nice, crisp, two-stage trigger. Now, when I first got my Tavor, I quickly realized there were two springs inside the trigger pack that were used to reset the sear in the trigger pack. I removed one of those springs. I showed you guys how I did that, and it reduced the trigger pull from around 12 pounds down to about 7 pounds. That's less than ideal, though. Now, while I've never had a reset problem, not a single issue with my trigger in my flat dark earth rifle, I have had reports from other users that have done a similar modification to their guns, and they said they had a few reset issues. What that means is you would pull the trigger, it wouldn't reset, you'd have to put your finger behind the trigger and push it forward and fire again. So again, that's less than ideal. I'm modifying a factory trigger that wasn't intended to be used that way. So we've been waiting for other companies to come out with drop-in trigger packs for the Tavor, because the Tavor is very trigger pack updatable friendly, because you just pop out 2 pins, the OEM trigger pack falls out, stick in a replacement trigger, and you should be able to go. But it's taken people quite a while to solve the problem of how to get that good trigger pull without decreasing the reliability. Now, Timony was the first to market with their trigger, and I do have one, and the trigger was not reliable. You saw some of the problems I had with that trigger in my night vision video that I shot at this very indoor range. It was giving me light primer strikes. It was also causing malfunctions. Every once in a while, the trigger would follow the bolt home, not the trigger, I'm sorry, the hammer would follow the bolt home, and that's not ideal at all, to say the least. So the next trigger that came out was the TAV-D. Now, I had a chance to talk to Art, who owns shootingsight.com. They're out of Cincinnati, Ohio, not too far from me. They came by the shop, and we did an interview, and I let him explain what he had done to modify the OEM trigger, to change it in some of the geometry, the critical geometry that he changed, to keep that reliability while reducing the trigger pull weight. So that's what we're going to show you this afternoon. Matter of fact, let's just jump over to the video where Art will talk about his trigger. That is nice. Very nice trigger. If you want to get the scoop on a product, it's best to go to the source. In this case, this is Art from Shooting Sight, and he is the creator of the TAV-D. Art, can you tell us about the trigger system and what the thought process was going into the designing of the trigger system, and what does it bring to market?
Sure. This is a two-stage trigger for the Tavor rifle. I was originally contacted about a year ago by a group of people on the bullpup forum who were interested in an approved aftermarket trigger. Nobody else at the time, the Tavor was new enough, nobody had plans on the market to develop one. So they contacted me and conned me into playing with it, and once I got interested, I couldn't let it go. I'm within a couple of weeks of launching. The trigger it's a two-stage trigger. The fundamental design for the sear and the disconnector were first developed by John Garand for the M1 in World War II. They've since been adopted by a whole bunch of ARs on the market today. The Extreme trigger, the Geissele trigger, several others are all two-stage designs deriving from that fundamental principle. I've engineered them into this package here. All of the parts in there are made out of the highest grade tool steel. It's plate tool steel, which is fully machined, so there's no cast parts in there. And the reason for that is to get the ultimate in sharp sear break. When you think of what happens in a sear, the hammer spring is loading up and putting a certain amount of force on the sear surfaces, and that force divided by the contact area gives you a sear pressure. As you pull a trigger down to 0 engagement, that force gets divided over a much smaller and smaller area, and eventually goes to an infinite pressure, which will cause the sear tips to eventually wear and round. So the higher grade steel that you can use, the sharper those sear tips will stay, and the sharper the break will be when the hammer actually releases. In addition, I've changed the design a little bit from the original Tavor design, because I am using an aluminum housing which is CNC machined instead of an injection molded housing. I've got some liberties in terms of where I can put material, and what it allowed me to do is get rid of some of the sharp tips out at the tip of the hammer. Those tips added a lot of mass far from the pivot point, which increases the polar moment of the hammer and slows it down. So I fully expect that once we get final testing done on this, that the hammer lock time on this can be maybe as much as a millisecond faster than the original Tavor hammer. In addition, the hammer spring has been beefed up. This is actually a high-energy hammer spring that is an adaptation, again, of an AR hammer spring. So it uses what they call in the industry missile wire. So it's very high tension, high force hammer, and it's had absolutely no problem in all the testing with igniting primers.
So this will fit into a standard Tavor with no modifications, correct? You just pop your OEM trigger pack out, drop this in, push the 2 pins?
Exactly right, exactly right. It's the fundamental pinholes are built to the identical Tavor dimensions, so it's going to be a straight swap out, about 15 seconds to do it.
We had an interesting conversation a little while ago. We were talking about what improvements you made to the trigger mechanism. Now, from what I understand, if I remember correctly what you were telling me, there is the way it was originally designed by the Israelis, there's the sear is at a mechanical disadvantage. And you've changed the contact point where the sear engages the hammer, giving yourself a mechanical advantage, which means you don't have to lighten the springs as much to get the desired trigger pull weight.
Total trigger pull that you feel in a system is a combination of the trigger springs that you need to overcome plus the drag of the sears against each other. When you get a strong hammer spring and the sear point is very, very close to the hammer pivot point, you get incredible pressure because you're operating at a very low moment arm. If you think about it like a wrench, if you get a long handle on a wrench, you don't have to pull nearly as hard to twist a bolt as if you get a little short handle. By getting the sear on the original Israeli design up close to the hammer pivot point, it generates huge force on the sears, so you get huge drag. You then get a double whammy because that sear contact point is also very far from the trigger contact point, so you're at a mechanical disadvantage to overcome it. By taking the sear and moving it much further away from the hammer pivot and much closer to the trigger pivot, you get it's a squared function in the calculation of how much drag it creates. So moving it up close to the trigger pivot point really drop the sear forces, drop the drag, and then in addition, all of these parts are getting a nickel boron coating, which is not only high hardness for anti-wear, but it's also a very low coefficient of friction surface, so you get a butter smooth pull and very low pull forces required, so I didn't need the strong springs.
And what that translates to is not having soft primer strikes.
Exactly.
You get full contact with the primer, you get positive ignition, but you have the benefits of a reduced trigger pull.
Exactly.
Great.
Exactly.
Thanks for the information.
You're quite welcome.
The TAV-D trigger system has been on the market now for a few weeks. It just recently released, but I've had my hands on this pre-production test sample for over a month. I was one of the first reviewers to get my hands on one. Art doesn't live too far from me. He lives over the border in Ohio, in Cincinnati, and he came up and visited, brought this pre-production sample for me to play with, left it with me, and I've had the opportunity to run it very hard in both my 9mm gun and my 5.56 gun. So while they're just now starting to ship, I've had this pre-production sample for a long time, and I've given it one heck of a workout and had no problems with it whatsoever. Now, this particular unit that I'm holding does have the aluminum housing, and it's now available both with the aluminum housing and the polymer housing. The aluminum housing, I guess, would be an upgrade for those of you that are concerned about polymer, but for those of you that want to buy the polymer housing and save a few bucks, I wouldn't be too concerned about the materials used in its manufacturing, because the Israelis themselves house their original OEM trigger in a polymer housing. Either way, it's up to you which one you'd like to pick up, but I do think either way it's the best trigger currently on the market for the Tavor. The Timony, not so hot. This, very hot. It's been working very well for me, and the trigger pull is absolutely amazing. It's a nice two-stage trigger pull, again about 5.5 pounds, which is about as light as I'd want a trigger pull for a defensive rifle, and that's how I use my Tavors. They are my defensive rifles. Putting the trigger mechanism in is very simple. Pull your old one out by pushing 2 pins, drop the TAV-D in, push the pins across, quick function check, load the gun and start shooting it. If you guys have any questions about anything you've seen in this video, you can ask those questions on our Facebook page. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/military arms. I also invite you to swing by and check us out on Instagram and Twitter. I'll put links to all that stuff down below. And also please swing by and check out coppercustom.com. Again, thanks for watching, everybody. Talk to you guys soon.